speak on Gandhi and link him with dissenting traditions in the West, or what is now, I suppose, called the North. What I'll do is begin with a few philosophical claims that are easily detectable in Gandhi's writing, and mention very briefly to start with two or three such claims, and mention also how they have affinities with dissenting voices in the Western intellectual tradition. And then what I'm going to do after listing these claims in no particular order is to construct an argument using these claims to come to a broad picture and philosophical conclusion that I think entirely squares with Gandhi's outlook on politics and culture and political economy. So let me just begin with two or three observations about Gandhi which have affinities with dissenting voices in the West. The chief figures that I'll link him with are dissenting voices in the 17th century during the English Revolution, that is, the radical Puritans, of which Christopher Hill was one of the early and very dominant commentators, with early Marx and with the very late Marx, which studied the Russian peasant community in his ethnological notebooks. By and large, I think if you focus on the early Marx and the very late Marx, and see the monumental marks of capital in the period in between as really informed by the early and very late Marx, it becomes obvious that Marx was a romantic thinker. And I think, in a sense, Gandhi was a romantic thinker. And I think the romantic tradition is a non-romantic tradition that starts with some of these dissenting voices in the 17th century and comes down all the way to Gandhi and to Horkheimer and Adorno and others in critical theory. So that's my potted way of making Gandhi linked with dissenting voices. So here are two or three theses which are detectable in Gandhi and which have premonitions and echoes in Western thought. The first is, it's a very interesting thing about Gandhi that he does not make liberty and equality, which are absolutely central ideals of the political enlightenment, doesn't make them central to his political thought. And I think that that's a conspicuous fact about Gandhi's political thought. And when I realized this as I was reading Gandhi many years ago in the 90s, I also realized that there's a very obvious comparison to be made with Marx, who dismissed liberty and equality as bourgeois ideals. So that made me begin to think of motivations for doing so. There's no doubt that Gandhi was not a socialist. He didn't have really even a basic understanding of the concept of class, so nothing of class struggle. But nevertheless, it is also obvious from reading in Swaraj and almost anything that Gandhi writes that he recoiled from capitalism and the mentality of capitalism as every bit as much as Marx. So there are things to explore here. The absence of focus on liberty and equality in both of them, and recoil from capitalist, from the outlook that emerged period. So that's one. The second philosophical focus in Gandhi is like the focus in many southern folk and spiritual traditions, which is that not ideals like liberty and equality, but there does seem to be a very often unspoken, but nevertheless very deep commitment to a different ideal, which is, there's no better word or expression for it, I think, than the ideal of an unalienated life. That seems to be an ideal that speaks to human concerns in a less abstract way than liberty and equality, and it's everywhere there in religious and folk traditions. So that's a second thing, the absence of some ideals, but an unspoken assumption and presumption of the importance of a quite different, less abstract, more human ideal. And the third point is that is there in Gandhi, which is there in a lot of popular Christianity in the West, but it's also there in Aristotle, but Aristotle is part of a high philosophical tradition, but it's everywhere there in popular Christianity, and it's a way of thinking in Gandhi which comes partly from his Gujarati Vaishnavism and the influence of some of the Gujarati Sant poets, but also the Bhakti influence on him. And this is, I would put it my way, because Gandhi would not put it this way. I'm a salaried philosopher, he's a philosopher, so there's a difference in the idiom with which I represent him. And he, I think the way to present it is to say that really Gandhi thought of ethics. So this is a slightly more abstract point. He really thought of ethics as a perceptual discipline. That is, unlike much of the orthodox intellectual tradition of the West, philosophical tradition of the West, he did not think that values came, as it were, as Adam Smith would put it, from our desires and moral sentiments. That's a view that you find in Hume and Adam Smith. But that's really channeling. Hume and Adam Smith are just channeling a Newtonian world picture in which the world, including nature, are completely evacuated of value properties. They only contain properties that the natural sciences study. So sometime in this, Weber describes this with the word disenchantment, sometime in the 17th century, because of the desacralization of nature and matter, the world began to be seen, and as the nature and the world began to be equated, what was called the phenomenal world, the perceptual world, began to be equated, literally, nature equals what the natural sciences study. This developed. I mean, there were hints of this, open hints of this in Bacon and Hartley and Galileo and Descartes on the continent, but with Newton, and they came to have a real influence, including an institutional influence, because Newton was really, whatever his crazy habits of alchemy and private study were, Newton began to be owned by the Royal Society, which was formed in 1660, and so the Newtonian world picture was that the world contained the divinity. God must be exiled from the perceptible world. It must have a providential place, and the world must be just what the natural sciences study. Even motion came from an external push from a providential, distant God. And so the idea that motion came from an inner source of dynamism, which was the presence of God in matter and nature, nature just ceased to be central at some point in the 17th century. And as a result, ethics and values began to be thought of as really reducible, or in some sense wholly dependent, if not reducible, to our desires and to our states of mind. Basically desires or passions, as Hume called them and Adam Smith called them, or when the passions and desires were loftier than moral sentiments. But they were sentiments, they were states of mind, they were not properties in the world. Whereas Gandhi, with all these influences that I mentioned, really had a completely different view. He didn't think that desires were the source of value or moral states of mind, but values were part of the world, and you perceived values. Values made normative demands on you because you saw the world in value terms. They made normative demands on you, and your agency consisted in responding to those demands. Now, of course, for Gandhi, I put that in very secular terms. For Gandhi, the source of value in the world around us was partly sacred, but what I want to stress is not just the sacred, but the fact that ethics is a matter of responding to the value properties you see in the world, which make normative demands on you, to which you respond. They're not generated by our desires. Our desires, in fact, are responses, if you like, to desirabilities, which are properties in the world, make normative demands to which our desires respond. So that's a very important part of a certain way of thinking. And it was very much part of the dissenting tradition. It was explicitly what Bruner said, it's explicitly what Winstanley said. And Winstanley openly said that the point of thinking of this way was what he called a great leveling process, that is, value should be perceptible to the visionary temperaments of everyone. It shouldn't be just have a sacred source that's available in scripture of judgment to university-trained divines. That's part of the perceptible world. And in fact, Kant is a very interesting, for all his disputes with Hume and the views about Hume and Adam Smith, which were very deep disputes, Kant actually was part of the picture that Gandhi's views and these dissenting views would have opposed, because Kant's picture of nature and the world, phenomenal world, to use his term, the phenomena, was a Newtonian picture. In fact, the whole of the Critique of Pure Reason was a consolidation of the Newtonian understanding of the world. And so value and ethics were relegated by him to some realm of pure practical reason that was noumenal, because the phenomenal world, the perceptible world, was entirely Newtonian. It's explicit in the preface or forward to the Critique of Pure Reason. Okay, so those are three claims. The relative lack of focus on liberty and equality, which links him with one very prominent tradition, Marxist tradition. The stress on alienation, which links him with early Marx and the very late Marx, but really links him with all sorts of traditions which discussed alienation, including religious traditions of popular Christianity in the West. And thirdly, this point about values being perceptible, making normative demands to our phenomenological navigation of the world. Okay, with these three things, which now I'll put aside for a moment and return to a little later in the construction of my argument, let me just raise a question which is, everybody's been discussing this for the last few decades in India, but it came to a head for me in a remark that Amartya Sen made in the Calcutta Telegraph. This was during the Singhur troubles a few years ago, basically eminent domain forms of dispossession of the peasantry and of the foresters, and not just in Bengal, but the dispossession of the commons amongst foresters. There was a lot of protest, as you all know, and Amartya Sen said against the protest. Amartya Sen said in the Calcutta Telegraph, and in the paper was essay was op-ed, opinion piece was also published in the Financial Times. He said, he said England had to go through its pain to create its Londons and Manchesters. India will have to do so too. So this is what Sen said against the protest. Now, first of all, it's obvious, this is a historical claim, a historical analogy, but it's historically very imperfect because people who were dispossessed in England to create its Londons and Manchesters moved in very large numbers to other countries in the temperate belt, particularly North America, and there's nowhere for the poor of Chhattisgarh or rural Bengal to go, because we have immigration laws now. Whereas, in fact, after the Bretton Woods institutions were remantled, capital has a mobility at the press of the button, and labor's mobility is constantly restricted by immigration laws. So, at a time maybe when capital's mobility was on a parity with labor mobility, which is when thousands of people immigrated to North America from London, maybe Sen had a point, but the point is that he's making an analogy, and the analogy is highly imperfect. But you see, quite apart from the imperfection of the analogy, what I'm interested in is what is this completely taken for granted assumption that what happened in England must happen here. This is what we've been grappling with when we talk of issues of modernity and alternatives to it for decades in India. But this was said with complete, just taken for granted that what happened in England must happen here. So let's just ask what went into that assumption on this particular issue. Right? I mean, lots of people have written on this assumption, but I'm interested in a very specific region in which this assumption is made by Sen, which is the dispossession of the commons of land along the, because I want to link it with what Talim was asking me to do, to link it with developments in the West and ideas in the West, which were dissenting also. So the enclosures dispossessed people through eminent domain forms of dispossession in Europe. And so this has a long history. And so I want to just make some of these connections and focus on Sen's assumption that what happened in Europe must happen in its erstwhile colonies, by focusing on this particular issue of dispossession of land, of the, let's say, the commons in particular, because it is one way of getting to the history of ideas, which is Talim's focus and which he wanted me to speak about. All right, so what underlies Sen's assumption, which I think is very widespread in the social sciences on this subject? Well, one might think that it comes from some belief in the iron laws of history, that what happened in Europe must happen elsewhere. But I don't believe that that's really how the tradition of thought from which Sen derives this. Sometimes that view that there are laws of history of this kind is attributed to Marx. It's a matter of vexed interpretation of Marx. But it's absolutely clear from reading the very late Marx, that is the many drafts, for instance, of the letter to Vera Zasevich, but also the preface to the second edition of the Communist Manifesto and other writings of his during this time when he was studying the Russian League. So his Russian ethnological notebooks make absolutely clear, explicit, that he repudiated a number of things that he said, not in Capital so much, but these popular articles he wrote on imperialism and colonialism in New York newspapers. In this very late work, Marx is absolutely clear that the Russian peasant commune did not have to be transformed into going through a capitalist incubation of the high noon of European development of capital, and that is a clear development in Marx which puts into doubt this notion of historical materialism, which is a word he never used, that is frequently attributed to him. And no doubt there are serious passages in Marx where he seemed to have suggested that there were such iron laws. I don't think that, despite the fact, I mean, quite apart from the fact that I don't think a considered reading of all of Marx's work, late, middle, attribute of belief in these iron laws to Marx. In fact, he's very critical of Henry Maine in the letter to Vera Zasevich for assuming that there are iron laws of history. I think really what's driving Sen is not even a misreading of Marx, but really Sen belongs to, as does most thinking in modern political theory in the post-Enlightenment tradition, it really comes from notions of rationality that are very much part of liberal thought, and they really come from a normative claim and not a deterministic descriptive claim. So the idea is not that what will happen, it's not, or not simply that what happened in Europe will happen here as a form of historical deterministic prediction, but what happened in Europe was rational, so it ought to happen here. And to the extent that rationality and history come together, which of course they do, say, for instance, in Hegel, the determinism is really informed by the normative. The predictive or descriptive is really informed by the normative, that it will happen because it ought to happen. And that ought is underpinned by a notion of the rationality of what happened in Europe. And so we should ask, what was the theoretical basis for claims about the rationality of the enclosures, the disposition of land, the privatization of property, at that time mostly land? Well, then again, the history is familiar. So there's John Locke's famous chapter in the second treatise, and it was, so that chapter was basically a philosophical consolidation of things that were happening historically for decades, well before Locke, many decades before Locke wrote the enclosures movement. But what Locke's ideas did was to present what was done by brute force in the enclosures, was presented as a moral and political achievement, to see it as a rational development. That's very much part of the way to the motivation point of what was going on in Locke on this question of the commons and its privatization. Now, let's just begin. So I'm going to start beginning to construct this argument that I threaten to do. One way to think of this intellectual history by which this process begins, that leads to Sen's casual assumption in that remark is it could be presented roughly as follows. The theory that presented this as a rational development was contractualist in nature. And social contract theory has not just Locke's, but anyone's. I'm focused on Locke because of this particular focus on Sen's remark and an interest in the commons and its disposition into private parcelization, but a general understanding of rationality in contractualist theory has it that we live in a pre-political world, which we call the state of nature. In later developments, it was called the original position, and so on. But it's an originary state. There's no polity yet, and there are no citizens yet. They're only human beings, mere human beings, and human beings live in a state of nature, and they come to consent to, agree upon, principles and arrangements to live by. And as soon as they make that consent or agreement to live by certain principles, they cease to be mere human beings, they become citizens, and the state of nature becomes a part. That's the general framework for understanding this contractualist thought experiment, which recurred in the intellectual history of the West. And the claim was that this development would be a rational development if it met two conditions. The condition A of the consent being freely chosen, and B, the consent making people better off than they were in the state of nature. Right? So there are two aspects to the rationality of the social contract. Two conditions which it must meet in order to be rational. And the Lockean contract, which is only marginally sophisticated by Robert Nozick, it's really, Robert Nozick is just spelling out what Locke said in a little more detail, mildly more sophisticated. The idea is that suppose there is the commons, we are all living in the commons, let's say all of us here, and some of us, the people on the right, each one of us on here just comes across stretches of land and we fence it. And so I fence it and Rahul fences it, you each fence off some bit of land, and we call it mine. We register it with some elementary form of bureau and our office which we set up, and once we register it, it becomes yours and yours and yours and mine and so on. And then we run out of the commons, and until we go to America, we've got these people who don't have this parcel out, privatized, fenced off land as mine and yours. So what we do is we recruit them and hire them for wages. And then we say, well look, we are better off because we've got our own land now, and they're better off because they have been recruited for wages, and so we're all better off than we were in the state of nature. And then Locke says, this just is a kind of this implicit consent, it's surely taken place, it's such a rational thing, and we can attribute an implicit freely chosen. I mean, nobody actually convened to do all this, but the thought experiment is that we can implicitly attribute this consent of this development historically as an implicit social contract because it meets these conditions of rationality. Now, so it's basically an argument, roughly an argument from Pareto improvement. I mean, I should be a little careful because the way this is, should be formulated is not that everybody's better off, but you always cover your back and you say, well, nobody's worse off and many are better off. Right? So you just allow for the limited case. So that makes it a clear case of what is called Pareto improvement. Okay, so this is just a very standard early phase in the thinking of some form of political economy, and Locke was its really in a way it's originated in this explicit sense anyway, and we have this idea that the beginnings of an idea that these developments were rational. Now, in the 27th chapter of Capital, Marx writes excoriatingly about not just the disposition of the commons, but the enclosures in particular. And many of the things Marx says in Capital, in that chapter, really was said in a completely different premonitional way, prescient way, by Winstanley. You read Winstanley's Laws of Freedom, you actually read any number of his more minor writings, there's an enormous anticipation and anger, of course, at the enclosures, but he really anticipates a lot of what Marx's hostility towards the enclosures. And so what I want to do, as I'm constructing this argument, is to put in Winstanley's mouth, and this is all anachronistic, I'm making this up, but that's what we philosophers do. So what I'm going to do is make up something to set forth a dialectic. I mean, dialectic has already been started by focusing on Locke, but I want to set forth a dialectic by presenting a counter-argument to Locke. And that counter-argument I'm going to just see as something obvious that can be said. None of what I'm saying is unobvious, by the way, it's pretty banal, but you can see it as something that you could plausibly attribute to people who are opposed, the dissenting voices that Daly wants me to identify. But here's what a dissenting voice might be taken to have said just by the fact that he and the radical Puritans around him were opposed to the enclosures. So here's Winstanley speaking. I'm ventriloquizing, but this is Winstanley speaking. He says to Locke, sure, you're right. People are better off than they were in the state of nature, just as you say, by the arrangements of privatization that you mentioned. But there's an opportunity cost. So opportunity cost is a term that economists use. It just means that when you make a choice, in making that choice, there's some benefits that are avoided by it. You just lose some benefits that you might have. So it's the cost of avoided benefits when you make a certain choice. Okay? That's what an opportunity cost is. So Winstanley says, Winstanley was before Locke, so this is really anachronistic, but a few decades before Locke. So Winstanley says, yes, you're right, we're better off than we were in the state of nature, but there's an opportunity cost. We're not better off than we would have been if you hadn't made the choice, this consent, and there was a collective cultivation of the commons instead. So it's a counterfactual. He says, you're right, better off than we were in the state of nature, but we're not better off than we would have been if that choice had not been made. So it's an opportunity cost argument. We're not better off than we would have been if we had not made a choice and had a collective cultivation of the comings instead. A collective cultivation. Just what Marx was talking about when he talked about the Russian me, the peasant coming in Russian. Okay, so that's a counter-argument of Winstanley's, right? Conceding something to Locke, but presenting a counterfactual. And therefore saying, what's the implication of this? The implication of this is there are two notions of consent. There's Locke's and there's Winstanley's. Right? Locke implicitly attributes consent to the privatization. Winstanley says, no, I have an alternative notion of consent. For me, people have not consented implicitly, historically, to anything like what you say, because consent for me is counterfactually formulated as what you would choose, in conditions that in fact did not obtain, because privatization took place. Right? So it's a different counterfactual notion of consent. And so the question is, which notion of consent is right? Locke's or this other one generated by the argument from opportunity cost? Now, Locke can just say, what is this? What is this? It's common stuff, counterfactuals and so on. I've just given you a perfectly rational notion of consent. It speaks conditions of rationality that I've laid down. So, what is Winstanley going to say if it's just refused? If he insists on his notion of consent, refuses Winstanley's notion of consent. Well, Winstanley has to say, is to point out, look, he says, I've given you an alternative notion of consent because I wanted to point out to you that your privatization was uncompulsory. Right? And yet meet the conditions of being better off. Now, if you insist on your notion of consent, then I'll have to point out that you're preempting the possibility of the being better off in this other way. And so I'll have to point out that those who did not possess the land, who were recruited to work for wage labor, those who did not possess the land only consented to these in the face of possession of the land by others. Those who did not possess the land, in the face of possession of the land by others, they consented, in your sense of the term, only unfreely. Right? The point of my introducing my notion of consent is to say there's another form of free consent, which meets your other condition. And if you insist on your notion of consent, then these people who don't possess the land, in the face of the possession of the land by others, if you insist that they consented in your sense of the term, their consent is being fraudulently presented as uncoerced. It's actually coerced by the condition that others possess the land and they don't. So, the thrust of this argument, this counter-argument, which I'm putting in Winstanley's mouth, is that both conditions, the two conditions of being better off than they were in the state of nature, and being freely chosen, can't be met jointly. Can't be met jointly. So that's the dialectic of the two, of this Winstanley's. All right, now, once you set this up, all this is very early intellectual history. Right? Even though I've distorted it and made it anachronistic and all, this disputation, the terms of this disputation, is very early, right? It's 17th century. The way of thinking that Locke first presents is an early chart, and that thinking was developed in a whole range of political thought about political economy and politics for centuries. It went through a utilitarian phase. Economists such as Jevons made some of this very explicit, all the way down to Nozick and others, but really very widespread assumption. Even those who oppose it really accept it and want to put constraints on it. So even Rawls and so on, I think, actually accept this whole way of thinking and just want to put sort of New Deal sort of constraints on it, maximum principles and things like that. Right? But the idea here is that I want to present is that luck is an early shot. There's a sort of opening shot in this way of thinking. A lot of thinking tries to consolidate this thinking and will want to present a counter-argument to Winstanley's argument against luck. And the whole ideology of the social sciences, really, and economic and thinking about political economy, develops this, and it has been most beautifully and succinctly summarized in a very, very influential paper. But the paper is not original. It's basically summarizing a whole way of thinking. It just does it in a beautifully encapsulated way, and has been extremely influential. And it's a paper called The Tragedy of the Commons by Garrett Hardin. And the point of the paper is, the reason why I've set up this dialectic, and I'm introducing this paper, because in my dialectic, the counterfactual, the role being played by the counterfactual in Winstanley's argument suggests that the alternative is a collective cultivation of the commons, and I'm saying that post-Lockean liberal thought about politics and the political economy was precisely a whole way and ideology of thinking to suggest that the collective cultivation of the commons is doomed to tragedy, and therefore privatization is the best bet. And so the tragedy of the commons just sums up this thing. It's a marvelous paper, just for that reason. It's nothing original in it. It's a marvelous paper, and it uses the techniques of game theory of basically multi-person prisoner's dilemma. None of that is difficult. It's very easy stuff. I can explain it to you very quickly, which I will, to just get the dialectic to some slightly further stage. So, the dialectical situation is, I've presented an argument against Locke on behalf of Winstanley. It presupposes an unproblematic notion of the collective cultivation of the commons, and the post-Lockean consolidation of Locke's thinking by further thinking in the liberal tradition says, sorry, that assumption won't do, it's doomed to tragedy. Okay? So what's the argument? It says it's doomed to tragedy. If you keep the technicalities out, the argument is perfectly straightforward. That is to say, the technicalities don't do anything but put a formal class on this straightforward argument, which is we're all in the commons, we're back in the commons, we're all individual commoners, and the commons and its collective cultivation depends on cooperation between us. And cooperation often takes the form of restraint in the commons. If it's fresh air, you can't drive your car or have your air conditioner on for so long. If it's cultivation, you can't over-cultivate, you can't overfish in the commons of the oceans, you can't overgraze if you have cattle. So that's often a cost of cooperation in the commons. Whatever the cost might be, if each individual pays the cost, everybody gains. That's taken for granted, it's obvious, it can hardly be denied, that if every individual cooperates in the commons, everybody gains. But, so this thinking goes that Hardin summarizes, each individual commoner thinks, well, what if I didn't cooperate? What would happen? The first thing he notices, the first thing he notices is, well, gain will be all to myself. If I don't cooperate, all the gain will be to me. If I cooperate, the gain is distributed over everybody. So maybe I shouldn't cooperate. It's gains would be immediate. But immediately gain from non-cooperation. The gains of cooperation would be long-term. He says, well, maybe that makes even more tempting not to cooperate, irrational to cooperate. But the final decisive thing, according to, in this multi-person prisoner's dilemma, is, look, I maybe should cooperate, but how do I know others will? And this is just decisive. When it comes to this, he says, I really can't be sure that others will cooperate. I mean, the epistemic dark about what others are going to do. It's what makes it a prisoner's dilemma. So, what if others don't? He says, the worst possible outcome is if I cooperated and others didn't. That's the worst outcome for me. So, that's decisive. Because if I don't cooperate, first of all, that gains are immediate, not long term. Second of all, they're all to myself, not distributed for everyone. Third, they're assured, which they never are, if I cooperate, because I don't know what others will do. So, it's just rational for me to not cooperate. But if everybody does the rational thing, the commons do it. It's destroyed. So, the countermeasure, it's irrational to collectively cultivate the commons. Might as well privatize, much better bet. Right? So this is the standard. The whole way of thinking is summarized in this. Then Stanley must stand refuted by this thinking. So that's the situation that I think is very much behind Stanley's remark. Right, this whole way of thinking. Now, Stanley is an honorable economist. I mean, I was so surprised to read that because he is in fact quite a brilliant economist. But all of these people, Sen, Rawls, even Elinor Ostrom, I'll come to that in a moment, who's written a really remarkable book on governing the commons, all of them, their view is, look, you have to accept this way of thinking. That's behind the assumption of this remark. You put constraints of safety nets, of welfare, and so on. But this kind of undermine this way of thinking. So now, what's interesting is that in the dissenting traditions of the West, Elinor Ostrom writes a book recently. She's a Nobel economist, though she's not actually an economist, but it's one of the few times that prize has gone to somebody who hasn't said repeatedly false things. But she says in this book, Governing the Commons, she points out that, look, it's kind of all of Carden's considerations, which summarizes a whole way of centuries-long way of thinking since Locke, really it doesn't show in any way that privatization is compulsory as a result of this argument. What it really shows is the necessity of policing and punishing non-cooperation. You don't have to go over to collect. Don't have to go over to privatization. You can have the collective cultivation of the commons and police and punish. And the whole book is a superb study in four continents, empirical study of how policing and punishment might be pursued when it comes to principles for that. Now, you see, my own view, and certainly Gandhi's view would have been, and Marx's view, for example, would have been, this is just not sufficient. I mean, you can see this as part of a general dissatisfaction with the idea of just constraints on capital. So those people, for instance, who think that Keynesian constraints were never going to work, which is being empirically now confirmed that they're not going to work, since neoliberalism, but this constraint, I think, is really, the idea of policing and punishment is just not thinking deeply enough, though she does superb work, once she thinks that this is the right framework of constraints to put. It doesn't go deeply enough for a very simple reason, that Eleanor Ostrom does not even so much as consider. But philosophers should raise this question, and our political theorists should raise this question, which is, if you accept the way of thinking that is summarized by Hardin, why would you cooperate in policing and punishment? Because that also requires cooperation. Right? Collective cultivation of the commons requires cooperation, but the success of regulation of this kind also requires cooperation. But if you can bribe somebody or threaten somebody, you can get away by non-cooperating with policing and punishment, bribing and threatening people. Right? Or bribing or threatening witnesses who cooperate with policing and punishment is absolutely standard. So the very fact of the possibility of bribing and threatening raises the same issue, one step up. Of why should I cooperate? Right? It may be rational not to cooperate if I can get away with bribing and threatening, etc. And in countries which congratulate themselves on having overcome the culture of bribes and threats, well, they do it by loopholing the law. Constantly do it. Just look at how virtually every arrangement of treaties, IMF agreements, and so on, are constantly loopholed, to say nothing of taxing the corporations and so on. So you can, bribes and threats could do it, and when you congratulate yourselves that you no longer have a culture of bribes and threats, you do it by more legal means. So I think that it's just simply not sufficient. I'm not against policing and punishment. That's fine. Who can be against it? But who can be against regulation? But I'm saying it doesn't dig deep enough to just simply do that. And what you need to do is question the whole way of thinking. So we are in the dialogue, the argument that I'm constructing so far. We're in a situation in which you've got Winstanley still vulnerable to this way of thinking, right? And Ostrom hasn't really rescued Winstanley. And I want to do it now by shifting to post-enlightenment political theory. I'm sorry I'm taking so long, but I can't really get anything across in a very short while. It's maybe a temperamental defect. So I'm going to have to now set up a little bit more of the dialectic. But that's where we are now. So I want to switch to a third phase of the lecture and get back to the question that I started with, which is why would somebody like Galileo, why does it make a lot of sense to reject liberty and equality as being on the center stage, as it has been for the political enlightenment? Well, one reason why liberty and equality are likely to be ushered off center stage, I think, though this is not explicitly currently announced, but it seems obvious to anybody who's studied the political theory of the Enlightenment, is that liberty and equality, as soon as they were formulated as ideals, were theoretically and methodologically developed in a way that put them advance in front of them. This is just a fact about the political theory of the last 300 years. So there's a sort of irresolvable tension I'm not just talking about theory, but in just how these concepts were developed and implemented. They seem to be at chronic odds with one another. They're just chronic odds with one another. There's a sort of zero-sum tension that if you promote the one, you seem to be doing it at the cost of the other. I mean, the Cold War was just, the rhetoric of the Cold War was just a very spectacular manifestation of this, with one side saying you're pursuing liberty at the cost of equality and vice versa. So this is just a fact about the theoretical developments of these concepts. So I think one of the things to be inspired by in Marx and Gandhi is to say, there's nothing compulsory about liberty and equality. In any case, don't seem to be jointly implementable because they're constantly tension with one another. So let's just look for another ideal which is more fundamental. And here is my basic thinking on this, is to say, what we can get from these from this dissenting voice in the West, like Marx, say, oh, it doesn't have to be Marx, there are elements of it in South, especially when he combines his views on alienation with his later work on Marxism, and you get it in Hannah Arendt and so on. But let's just stick with Marx and Gandhi. What I want to do is to say that you could make the following claim, inspired by the stress on alienation and the de-stress or de-emphasis on liberty and equality. So here I'm going to just go to the board. So you have liberty and equality, and I see that in yours, learn to be in tension with one another. And what I want to get from Gandhi and Marx, thank you. So my thought is, you just move them off center stage. That's what Gandhi and Marx would, in any case, do. It's not central to political thought. And you put on center stage instead an even more fundamental idea, right? The unalienated life. And you bring these back as necessary conditions for this. So they're not on center stage, they're subsidiary. This is on center stage. You bring these back, but as merely necessary conditions, so that's a subsidiary. This is the fundamental idea. Okay. And my hope is that you get a picture of liberty and equality where this tension would be removed if you saw them not on center stage, which the tension was there as we had it from the political enlightenment. When these were on center stage, they were in tension. But if there are merely subsidiary necessary conditions for this, you make the tension has a chance of being removed. Okay. But then maybe you could touch it. So that's the thought. Now, the interesting thing is, we need to ask, what the hell is this? And what is interesting to me is that Marx, Gandhi explicitly in his Swaraj, and also Sartre, Arendt, and other writers, they've written on alienation, have all said that alienation is a modern malaise. It's a malaise of modernities. Pre-modernity never had the alienation. Pre-modernity had the unalienated life. Pre-modernity had lots of other defects. Lots of other defects. But the sense of belonging was always there, even for slaves, serfs, and so on. Right? So we have these omnibus terms like feudal, etc. Well, okay, let's use that. It's very misleading. But even in feudal societies, however oppressive they were, however defective, this was there. Alienation was not a defect. Because as alienation is understood, whatever the form of oppression of serfs and so on were, alienation, it had a sense of belonging and so on. All right, so let's just say that pre-modernity had this, accompanied by a lot of other defects, but it had this, according to all the theorists of alienation that I know of. Now, if that is right, we historically, and doing this part of intellectual history, these were introduced precisely to overcome the defects which accompanied the unalienated life of pre-modernity. And that was the point of the Enlightenment introducing liberty and equality, that they were meant to address the other defects, the defects that existed with this ideal in pre-modernity. So, when I'm seeking to make the center stage, but bringing these in as necessary conditions for this, I can't accept this to be the unalienated life of pre-modernity, because the unalienated life of pre-modernity precisely was not accompanied by this. These were introduced in order to overcome the defects that accompany the presence of this. So what I'm really doing is seeking a transformation of all three concepts together. Right? I've already said I'm seeking a transformation of these concepts by making this central, removing them from center, and seeing them merely as necessary conditions. But I'm now saying that I'm also seeking a transformation of this concept, because this was accompanied by precisely lack of this and this, and I'm seeing these as necessary conditions for this. So this can't be the original notion of an unalienated life as existed in pre-modernity. So I want a triangular transformation of all three together. Right? That's the idea, I think, that we have to tap this tradition when we try and combine. Okay, now I'll just tap that. So now, that's a way of approaching how you might get these triangular transformations. So let's ask the question, what is it about these two concepts that make them so much at odds with one another? What made them so much at odds with one another when they were on center stage? Well, we know already that one thing that made them at odds with one another we've been discussing for a while, which is that the possession of property bestowed on the possessor of property is certain liberty, and that got enshrined in the law of the land, and how that generated inequality is extremely well known. Marx was its most famous critic, but everybody knows the ways in which, when liberty got attached to individuals' possession of property, it generated inequalities. So that's one source of the tension between liberty and equality. Right? But here is another thing that I think is really much more psychologically central. And that is that liberty got into tension with equality, not just because it got attached to property, but because it got attached to talent, to individual talent. This is an extremely deep and central, I mean, we know the depth of the ways in which liberty attaching to property generates inequalities. It's just very familiar, but much less theorized is the way in which inequalities are generated when liberty got attached to the notion of desert, and through the notion of desert to individual talent. Because individual talent then gets incentivized by the prospect of reaping the rewards of one's talent as a right. As a right of one's liberty. You want to ask, what has it got to do with liberty? It's obvious what it's got to do with liberty. Think of it. If there was some excellence of production, say a great scientific theory, or a beautiful poem, or a great test century, and so on, right? Suppose there were these excellences, right? And suppose you did what was done centuries ago, perhaps, which is when something of excellence emerges, you praise the zeitgeist, right? You don't praise the individual, you don't shower benefits on the individual, you just say, wasn't that a great time, or wasn't that a great civilization, and so on, that it produced this? So, but, at some point, people began to say, wait a minute, you can't just praise the zeitgeist, because you're denying the person's individuality who produced the theory or the poem or whatever it is, right? You're denying the individuality. It's his right to reap the rewards and praise for his individual talent. Otherwise, individuals would just be physical embodiments of the zeitgeist. That's no way to think of individuals, right? So you have to actually incentivize talent, you praise and reward talent and so on, and that became an essential art through the notion of desert, an essential art in the political theory. And even, by the way, even when people try to get rid of this by talking about equality of opportunity, when they try to get rid of talent as a bit of luck, that everybody must start off with equal opportunity, effort is not. Even theorists of equality of opportunity want to say a person's effort must be rewarded. Right? So it just goes very deep. The notion of desert goes extremely deep in our liberal thinking, and we consider that hysterically egalitarian ideologue to say no, people should get absolutely no rewards for their individual talents and so on. So it's just part of the thinking by which this gets attached to property, to individual talent, to individual property, and obviously generates equalities. So there are all these properties which give rise to this, and that's why I'm setting up this dialectic. And now, if we wanted to have a triangular transformation of all three concepts, which I'm trying to do, right? So my idea is, these are stuck in this internecine tension as we've developed them theoretically, and I've just given you two aspects of the theoretical developments which give rise to tension and equality, right? So I'm saying, move them from center stage, make this central instead. Bring them back in as merely necessary conditions, not on center stage anymore. And maybe you'll get a chance to remove the tension between them. But I'm also saying, this, which never existed, which always existed until modernity, right? This can't be what existed prior to modernity, because prior to modernity, this existed without liberty and equality. Liberty and equality were precisely introduced to overcome those defects. And so, since I'm seeing liberty and equality as necessary conditions for this can't be the unaliened life of pre-modernity. So I am really together trying to, using this to change this, and changing this, changing this by seeing this as a necessary condition. So really we have to do it all in concert at once, all three at once. It won't do to do it step by step. But on the other hand, given what generated this tension between these two, in my work, what I've tried to do is to suggest that we can come up with a notion of liberty, which is not this Skinner thing about Republican liberty, certainly not Berlin stuff from negative liberty and all, but to maybe construct a notion of liberty, begin there, which is of a piece with the notion of the unalienated life. And that's what I want to quickly do before stopping. So, and then summing up. So here's the thought. A lot of the tension between this and this comes from this attaching to things in a way that is, so by the way, I'm really completely and only talking about individual liberty. I have no interest in collective liberty, interesting though that might be. So none of this can be assimilated to Rousseau and all that. Rousseau got into a lot of trouble for being an inspiration for the Jacobin aftermath of the French Revolution and so on. I'm not steering anything to any idea of collective liberty, not at all. Right? So there's no Jacobinism, no idea of general will, nothing of that kind. Not seeking anything. I'm really looking to find a reconfiguration of individual liberty and thereby equality, so long as we keep this firmly in view as being central and motivating everything about this dialectic I'm setting up. So, let's ask, so my claim is that what generates this inequality is a notion of individual liberty that is too individualistic. So now that sounds paradoxical, but I really want to stress that. I want reconfigure individual liberty, not collective liberty. I'm not interested in that. I want to reconfigure individual liberty in a way that makes it less individualistic. Okay? That's what comes from seeing it tied to this. I want to explain that. So what I want to do is to first ask, well, what is liberty? Well, liberty in its most general, almost vacuously general form is the idea of self-governance. That is, we make decisions, moral, political, cultural, decisions of how to live and so on. We make these decisions, and we should be able to make them ourselves and shape our material and spiritual lives by our decisions. That's what liberty is. That we govern ourselves, our decisions shape our material and spiritual lives. That's what a completely general and banal definition of liberty. Okay. So, it's individual decision making. Individual, I'm not interested in collective liberty, not general will or anything. Individual decisions which consist in one's self-governance, which consist in the exercise of liberty. All these are synonymous ways of speaking. These things are, I'm saying, to be conceived non-individualistic. Individual decisions of what to do, how to live, etc., which means self-governance, which means the exercise of liberty, ought to be conceived non-individualistically. Now, what does that mean? It sounds just like a paradox. What does it mean? Okay, so now let's go back to that third point that I started with, which is what it is to make one's individual decisions responding to the normative demands we see in the world around us. Right? That's very deep in a lot of thinking. It only was overturned by Hume and Adam Smith and Kant and so on, relatively late in the Western Orthodox tradition. I want to go back to dissenting traditions and to Gandhi and so on, where the idea is that when we live and make the decisions we live, we just respond to things around us. And things around us are not to be described in scientific terms, they're to be described in value terms. Something is a threat, something is cruel, something is considerate, something is kind, etc. You see kindness in people's actions, you see cruelty in people's actions, you see poverty, these are all value descriptions of the world. And we are just responding to them. We're not making up values, we're just responding to the world around us. It's a perceptual discipline. Now, I just want to say this as an aside. People will ask, well, but don't you think there's ethical deliberation and moral deliberation? Why is it all perceptual? Yeah, there is ethical deliberation, but the primary thing is perceptual, phenomenological. You just see something and you respond to it. Now, deliberation comes when you might see conflicting things. Right? You see two different normative demands coming on you from the world. Then you might say, you might weigh and rank and so on and so forth, and that's all that deliberation can. That's a secondary sophistication. What the whole tradition that I'm talking about says is, the basic thing is that you relate immediately and respond with your agency to the normative demands that come from a world described in value terms. Right? So the world doesn't just consist in H2O, it consists in a substance which has value. Lord knows it, the whole world is fighting over this substance now. So it obviously has value of various kinds. It's not just H2O. So that's the idea. So now let's ask, when you put that together with what we what we have here, which is looking at the world, making our decisions in a non-individualistic way, that means you have to see the world. Right? If the exercise of liberty is making decisions which shape your material and spiritual lives. And making decisions, going back to the first thesis, is responding to the world's the perceptual world's normative demands on you. You've got to see the values and the normative demands around you non-individualistically, i.e., you've got to see them, and this is really a phenomenological point. I want that to be clear, that this perceptual discipline of ethics mean to be taken completely literally and seriously. So the idea is that I have to literally see the normative demands of the world, each individual, because this is individual liberty. Each individual has to see the normative demands of the world from a larger point of view than her own. That is what it is to have a non-individualistic notion of individual liberty, which consists in these decisions of what to do, how to do, etc. You have to literally see the world from a larger point of view than your own. There's nothing paradoxical about this. Look, it happens in bodily phenomenology all the time. All the time. So, the example I like to give is, look at what happens, what's the difference between walking on the road and driving on the road? When I walk on the road, I navigate, I see the normative demands around me from my individual body's point of view. I'm walking on the road and I see there's something, I move and avoid it and so on. It's all my body oriented on the world, individual body. But when I'm driving a car, I see the world's normative demands ahead of me from the point of view that's larger than my own individual body. I see it from the point of view of the car. It's completely natural thought that your phenomenological perception of the normative demands of you can be seen from a larger point of view of the world. Whether it's a bodily point of view or if it's an ethical point of view and so on. And so my thought is that if you see liberty in those terms, which I'm saying come from being alienated, I'll explain that in a minute, then the decisions you make in the exercise of liberty and self-governance are not likely to be, this is the way to put it. If you see liberty along these non-individualistic lines, equality would not be theorized as some further or extra bonus thing to be achieved. It would emerge out of the deliverances of the exercise of liberty so conceived. Right? When individual liberty is exercised from a larger point of view than your own, then equality would not necessarily be something to have trade-off relations with. That's really what has to be avoided. It's not something that is to be a trade-off. It just is likely to emerge from liberty so conceived and exercised along these lines from a larger point of view than your own, in each individual case. So, what has that got to do? Okay, so that's how this tension is addressed, but what's that really got to do with the unalienated life? Well, I think that this way of exercising liberty does not even come into focus. Now, I'm going back to the part of the dialectic where we have left Winstanley vulnerable to this way of thinking. I think that if this whole way of thinking about politics and political economy turns on the question summarized by Hutton, which is that third qualm or protest or question, what if I did it? What if I cooperated and others didn't? And that's what's driving the whole thinking. And the third question, what if I did it and others didn't? The claim is that, so I'm now returning to that part of the argument. That question, that protest which generates the consolidation of Locke by current liberal thought, that question of the commoner, of the rationality of the common, when the rationality of the common is defined and driven and motivated by that question, I'd say that question is a symptom precisely of being alienated. What the unalienated life is precisely a life that preempts the possibility of the question arising. In an unalienated society, with unalienated social relations, the idea that I would even so much as have the qualm, what if I cooperate and others do, is a symptom that one is not living in an unalienated society. That's a symptom of alienation. In fact, I think game theory is a higher order symptom of alienation. So that's the link between this and this. Right? If you had this, you wouldn't ask that question. This notion would be a notion of being exercised in a way that this wouldn't be in trade-off relations. And even so much as to have the qualm that gives rise to the consolidation of love against Winston would be a sign that this is where we are failing. Mind you, I just want to end by saying this. I am not talking, this is not just a critique of self-interest. I'm not saying you oughtn't to be self-interested, you oughtn't to be a free rider and not cooperate and so on. I'm not making any moralistic claims, right? I'm trying to construct a way of thinking that I derive from Gandhi, Marx and others, a whole way of thinking, which doesn't say it's wrong to ask the question, what if I cooperated and others didn't? But it's a way of thinking which doesn't allow the question to so much as emerge. It is a bit of nonsense to ask it. It's incoherent to ask it. I'm not saying it's wrong. If I had said it's wrong, I would have put here something like fraternity or solidarity. You should be nice to others, compassionate to others. Yes, you should be all that. But I'm talking about another thing. Not all good things are the same good thing. Right? I'm looking for a completely different good thing, which is an abstract thing, which doesn't say that it's wrong to ask the individual commoner's question that gives rise to the tragedy. I'm saying that question should not even be on the horizon of his thought if he's thinking along these lines. So the reason why it's not just a critique of self-interest, but for many reasons, even if it were a critique of self-interest, nobody has given a critique of self-interest which is in the service of the construction of a notion of liberty, which is what I'm doing. But it's not really a critique of self-interest for the simple reason that I'm not saying it's wrong, I'm saying the question is preemptive, thereby showing that overcoming alienation and seeing the world correctly are not two things, they're the same thing. Alienation, overcoming alienation and seeing the world right from a larger point of view, etc., are not two different things, they're the same thing. Okay, sorry to have taken so.